Okay, today we're going to talk about the sociological theories on gender and sexuality. First up, we'll talk about functionalism and functionalist view of gender. So remember, functionalism looks at society as a complex system of many separate but integrated parts. So it looks at the way that gender organizes social life. Talcott Parsons talked about gender and complementarity. So looking at traditional gender norms, he saw that they create these kind of complementary roles. So by linking men and women into family units, he saw that men did certain tasks and women did other tasks. So men tend to do instrumental behaviors. These were task-oriented, things to accomplish, check off the list kind of things. And women tend to be more expressive, looking at care for other people, care for children, care for the household, care for the husband. So these kind of complementary roles make sure that families are taken care of, children are taken care of, husbands are taken care of, the household is taken care of, and somebody is getting paid to pay for the house. So you have a roof over your head and it's nice and clean. And Parsons argued that having separated roles, women doing one kind of thing, men doing another one, allowed them to specialize. And so they would get better. Women would get better at taking care of children and taking care of the household because they did it more. Men would get better at their labor market work because they did it more. The way that this happens in society, society encourages this kind of gender conformity because there's this fear of rejection. So if you don't do what you're supposed to do as a good man or as a good woman, then you can get ridicule, you can get criticism, you can get sanctions from the outside world. And you don't want that. You're afraid of that. So you comply. You do what you think you're supposed to do. So this can be, girls growing up in high school and not wanting to show how smart they are because girls aren't supposed to be smart, for example. One of the things that Parsons and others have pointed out, though, is that industrialization leads to more gender equality. So when you are in an agrarian farm type community, the specialized gender roles makes more sense than when you are in an industrialized nation, when everybody goes and works out of the household. So when everybody is going to work out of the household, then it doesn't make as much sense to think about these differentiated or specialized roles. All it ends up happening is that women then are expected also to work outside of the home and to work inside of the home. So how does functionalism view sexuality? Well, functionalism looks at the function of society overall, so it would point out that sexual reproduction is necessary for the healthy functioning of society. And it's social norms that can help control that society and reproduction of society. So social norms are intended to control who has sex with whom and why so that society itself can continue. So looking at things like the incest taboo, so the taboo against having sex with a close member of the family can prevent some genetic diseases that are caused by reproduction between family members. So then what are the solutions for these problems in gender and sexuality, the social problems in gender and sexuality? Well, first, functionalism would say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So if we accept the assumption that gender differences do not necessarily mean gender inequality, then a social problem doesn't exist, right? If we can just say that there's differences between men and women, but they're valued equally, then that's no problem. Likewise, if we need social norms to govern sexual behavior to ensure that we have an adequate population, then we don't need to worry about what the sexual norms are. But of course, in both of these instances, if we do think that the gender differences have value differences, then that's going to be a problem. If we don't need these social sexual norms to make sure that society is reproducing, then that's a problem. That's a social problem. So if it is broken, if there is a social problem with gender and sexual orientation, then other social institutions such as the government or education or family need to reform and strengthen our ideas and our behaviors around gender and sexuality. So this would mean, for example, the government needs to institute new laws that prevent gender discrimination, and we have to monitor that, for example. So what are the critiques of functionalism? Well, first of all, it assumes a unified vision of society, but we know that that's not true. So we know that not everyone believes that there should be specialized gender roles, that women should do one thing and men should do another one. We know that not everyone agrees about the sexual hierarchy, about what you can do and with whom. So the assumption that we all agree about this is not necessarily in place when we come to the overall functioning of society. The other thing is that Parsons' analysis really ignores the personal strains and the social costs of these rigid gender and sexual roles. So the women who are subject to the kind of criticism because they're not keeping a good home feel the strain much more than the men if they're in a home that's unkempt, right? It doesn't fall on men. Men don't feel the strain of having a messy home. The assumption is the woman keeps a messy home. Then finally, for those who are seeking sexual equality, this kind of gender complementarity really amounts to little more than just women submitting to male domination. So the argument is, if everyone has their place and everyone sticks to their place, then society functions well. What that means is women should just submit. That's the kind of underlying argument. If women were just in their place, then everything would function smoothly. But you know, that's not really where we want to be, because it's not always a happy place to be. So that's part of the problem with this. It doesn't map all, not everybody wants to embrace these kinds of roles. Okay. Gender, what's the conflict? What's the conflict view of gender? Now remember that conflict is focusing on the unequal distribution of power. So they'll argue that gender is not just about behavior, but it's about power. And those traditional ideas about gender benefit men the same way that the oppression of racial and ethnic minorities benefit whites. So the underlying problem with both of those is the unequal distribution of power and how power maps to race and power maps to gender. So these kind of conventional ideas about gender create division and tension. They create the kind of conflict that we're talking about. So the conflict view, being concerned with power, focuses on these kind of 4 principles of power. The first, that power yields privilege. When you have more power, you have more privileges. And then the privileged lifestyles encourage those in power to feel they are superior beings. So you have power because you're in a certain social position. You have a lifestyle that flows from that privilege, and that encourages you to feel like you are better than other people. At the same time, the powerful people clothe themselves with ideologies that justify their position. So they have belief systems that where they are in the social hierarchy is justified, that the way that they exploit or oppress others is justified because of their position in the social hierarchy. So all of this is used so the power justify their greater privilege. And when they do, they use economic and legal weapons against women and sexual minorities. So we've seen all kinds of legislation against women and sexual minorities. And the conflict perspective is that is about the expression of power. So reproductive laws that say when women can have an abortion or when women can have access to birth control. The conflict perspective would say that's all about power. It's not about something to do with health and wellness. It's not even about the reproduction of society. They're arguing that it's about power and control. It is important to notice, however, that power and privilege are not equally distributed among men. So we're not saying all men oppress all women, but the distribution of power is important to take note of, that there are some consistent differences in the allocation of power to men and women. But there's always going to be individual differences. There's going to be individual cases where that's not the case, where there isn't an unequal distribution of power. So remember, the conflict perspective relies a lot on Marxism. Marx's buddy Friedrich Engels, they were co-authors, talked explicitly about gender and class. Marx himself didn't talk so much about gender. He was really focused on class, but Engels thought that gender was an important component. So Engels pointed out that capitalism intensifies male domination. So capitalism creates more wealth, and wealth gives greater power, particularly to men, because they're working in the labor force as earners or owners of property. So that creates more inequality because men are doing the activity that confers more power compared to women. However, because capitalism always has to expand, capitalism has to keep finding new consumers, new markets. Women do get involved in capitalism, but as consumers. So women are targeted as the members of the household that will purchase for the household. This is one of the reasons that you see so many advertisements that feature women doing laundry and picking out the perfect drapes for the household, because the assumption is that women are going to be the consumers to furnish the house, to maintain the house. And then also there's all those other advertisements that what is valuable about women is their beauty. So there's all these beauty products for women. And Engels would argue that all of that is necessary because capitalism needs more markets. It needs to encourage us to keep buying and buying and buying. So the other part of this is if women do maintain the home, then it frees men for work. So if men are able to go out and work in the labor force, they can be more productive, they can earn more money, and they get less tired because they come home and then the house is all taken care of. And that's fine and great, except for what happens when women go into the labor market. So they're still expected to go into the labor market and then come home and do what is called now the second shift, come home and do more household labor. A lot of this, though, Engels talked about as the double exploitation of capitalism. So on the one hand, all the men going out to earn wages, they are paid low wages. So men are paid low wages for their labor, but then women are paid no wages at all. The labor that women do in the household is completely uncompensated, and yet it benefits capitalism. So now, how does the conflict view look at sexuality? So designating certain sex acts as bad or wrong creates categories of people then who are seen as bad or wrong, and then they are frequently exploited and oppressed. This relates to a concept called heteronormativity. So our society is built around the belief that only two genders corresponding to biological sex exist, and that the only acceptable sexual behavior is between these two genders. So you'll notice that this is sort of taken for granted, even though it doesn't, as we've talked about with gender and sexuality, it doesn't link specifically to sexual reproduction or to biology. The belief that it does encourages this belief that heterosexuality is the norm, is natural. And so then it creates these categories of wrongness that are based going against the idea of heteronormativity. And the conflict perspective would say that that's a constructed category to reinforce the distribution of power. Both of these relate to the concept of patriarchy. So it focuses mostly on gender, but the same concept can apply to sexual minorities. So patriarchy is a system of social structures and practices in which men govern, oppress, and exploit women. This can be both formal and informal. So it can be formal male dominance, like some of the reproductive laws we've seen. So access to birth control. That is a formal way of men dominating women. But it can also be informal in terms of the roles and the values and beliefs that we have about who does what in the household, who does what at work. All of these can be very informal expressions of male dominance. Radical feminists would argue that this is intentional. So they'd say that men's oppression of women is deliberate and that they have ideological justification of that domination provided by other institutions. So, for example, media and religion provide these scripts that justify the domination of men over women. And if you have a story from a powerful institution that justifies domination, it makes it much more likely that it will happen. So radical feminists argue that this is one of the ways that this happens, and it becomes embedded into society in ways that we can't really see. So what are the solutions from the conflict perspective? Well, there are some moderate solutions, things like strengthening wage and equal opportunity laws. So we already have a lot of laws that require equal opportunity. The conflict perspective would say, if you want to be moderate about it, let's make those stronger. Let's make sure that there are more actual equal opportunities and not just on the surface. We could also increase access to resources, to financing, to training for women and sexual minorities, that this would help to balance out the power inequality if women had more access to opportunities to gain power. Likewise, we could increase the representation of women or sexual minorities in public office. So politicians, CEOs, people in positions of power. We could actively try to recruit women and sexual minorities into positions of power. We could also criminalize violence against women or sexual minorities, including things like sexual harassment. And we've seen this happening more and more, that we are starting to criminalize activities that were totally taken for granted. A lot of the sexual harassment that has happened at work that people are speaking out about, that we are legislating against, not too long ago was completely taken for granted as just part of the normal workforce. The idea here with these moderate solutions really is that you change the laws and that changes the culture. So if you change the laws and you make certain behaviors illegal, certain ways of discriminating illegal, then that will eventually change the culture and we will stop thinking about groups differently. There are more radical solutions in the conflict perspective, and those would be things like abolishing the traditional family forms. So get rid of marriage altogether. So if there's inequality in the family because of the value of husbands compared to wives, well, let's just get rid of the concept of husbands and wives, the radical solutions would propose. Likewise, the idea there is that you would really radically reorder society to abolish patriarchy, to abolish the unequal distributions of power. And there's critique of the conflict perspective, of course. The conflict perspective tends to minimize the extent to which men and women live together cooperatively and often quite happily. So overall, the conflict perspective, because it focuses so much on conflict, on the unequal distribution of power, it tends to overlook the very many ways many of us in society work well together, cooperate under conditions of equality. Okay, up next, interactionism. So let's talk about gender identity. Gender identity are the internalized norms, values, and behaviors of gender expectations. So things that we expect men to do, things that we expect women to do. These are our ideas about masculinity and femininity. We can look at the differences by gender and we notice things like, for example, boys tend to define goals as they talk. They tend to exert control. This is kind of the mansplaining and talking over people that you've probably heard about. Boys and men tend to express independence and assert social status when they're speaking. Girls and women, on the other hand, tend to speak much more tentatively. They tend to use a lot of the tentative clauses, like I think, I suppose. They tend to be more supportive, inclusive, and responsive. So why is this? Why do we see these kinds of differences in the ways that boys and girls talk? Well, the interactionist perspective would say that this is learned behavior. It's based on what's called social learning. So social learning theory says that gender identity develops from imitation, that we watch other people, and that then we practice those behaviors, and then we are rewarded or we are punished. And the behaviors that we engage in, we do more of them if we get rewarded, we do less of them if we get punished. So boys learn to act like their fathers and their brothers, and they learn not to act like their sisters or their mothers. Boys get praise when they are acting in what we would consider gender appropriate masculine ways, and boys get punished or criticized or ridiculed when they act in ways that we think are appropriate for femininity or for women. We also see plenty of role models in television and in social media that reinforce the ideas about what women should do or what men should do. And then there's this concept of gender and the looking glass self. So the idea with the looking glass self is that we construct who we are based on what others feed us. That it's basically we see ourselves in others' eyes. Other people are our mirror to show us who we are. That we engage in various behaviors, we'll do something, and then we look to see what the consequences of that are. What kind of sanctions we get. Do we get praise or do we get ridicule? And when we get praised for something, we're more likely to internalize it and do it again. When we get criticized for something, we're more likely to stop it or to feel bad about it in any case. Mead took this, it talked about this in terms of role taking. He said that early on in life, we actually, as very young children, we imitate both our mothers and fathers. We imitate men and women. But over time, we learn what is more appropriate. We learn how to become more gender specific, and then we internalize it. So how would interactionism talk about sexuality? Well, sexuality is socially constructed. This is a hard one for many of us because we have these beliefs of sexual behavior as being biological. But honestly, what we think of as sexual behavior is not linked to biology or sexual reproduction. If it were, if sex were only about sexual reproduction and it was linked to our biological need to procreate, then we wouldn't have things like oral sex or anal sex that have nothing to do with sexual reproduction. So we already have decoupled sex from biology, but we haven't done that in our ideology. We have these sexual scripts. Sexual scripts are cultural and social stories that dictate the when, where, how, and with whom of sex, and it helps us understand what sex means when it happens. So what counts as sex and what the consequences are of sex are built into these ideas of sexual scripts. And different sex acts have different meanings around the world, have different meanings around times of life, and in different contexts. So we can't say that there are some that is a sex act that means the same thing in all contexts. So for example, same-sex acts in prison. We often think of these as a different sort of act. It's a same-sex sex act, and we would think of that as being gay or homosexual, but we wouldn't always necessarily think of the person as being a homosexual, as somebody who's engaging in a same-sex act based on a particular context. Okay, so what are the solutions for the problems in gender and sexuality from the interactionist perspective? Because this is about systems of meaning, this interactionist perspective is going to say one way to solve the problem is to increase our awareness of gender or sexual inequality. That we take a class like this, we learn more about gender and sexuality, and that can then change our behaviors, our way of being. We can point out problematic language. So we have a tendency to take language for granted, but if you can think about the ways that people will try to put a man in his place is by accusing him of being feminine. So you'll tell a man, quit being such a sissy, or stop, you're acting like a fag. That is a way of controlling men's gender and sexuality, but at the same time, it creates inequality because it's denigrating women and sexual minorities. Then we can also create empowering images. So the power of images, interactionists would say that helps shape our understanding of the world. And if we have images that always show men in a particular way, or women in a particular way, sexual minorities in a particular way, that creates a problem, because then it starts to recreate our ideas. It creates our ideas about what men, women, sexual minorities are or should be. So if we create a broader array of images and more empowering images, more media, more films, more songs, more television shows, all of that will create a more diverse representation of gender and sexuality. So that's it.